Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past isn't just remembered, it's revived. Today we dive into one of the most dramatic, complex, and world-shaping stories of modern history. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the birth of a new global order. This isn't just a history lesson. This is the story of how an empire collapsed without a world war. How one leader's vision of openness and reform spiraled beyond his control. How 15 new nations were born from the ruins of a superpower. And how the aftershocks of 1991 still rattle the world we live in today, from Europe to Asia to the Middle East to the United States itself. In this full series, we'll journey through the chaos of perestroika and glasnost, the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe, the rise of oligarchs and the reawakening of Russian power, the conflicts in Chechnya, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, China's strategic transformation after watching the Soviet collapse, America's unchallenged dominance in the 1990s, and the long-term consequences that shape modern geopolitics today. If you want to understand why today's world looks the way it does, you must understand the story of how the Soviet Union fell. So sit back, open your mind, and let's travel into one of history's greatest turning points. This is the fall of the Soviet Union, only on History Teller YT. Social fragmentation deepened as communities adapted in different ways. Some groups thrived in the new market economy, especially those involved in trade, small businesses, or emerging industries. Others fell into long-term poverty. Rural areas, which had depended on state-supported agriculture, suffered from collapsing collectives and declining infrastructure. Entire towns built around single factories or mines faced economic ruin. Crime and corruption spread rapidly as law enforcement institutions weakened. Organized crime groups, known as mafias, filled power vacuums, controlling markets, extorting businesses, and influencing politics. The collapse of the social safety net had long-lasting implications. Trust in government eroded, replaced by a belief that success depended on personal connections, wealth, or luck rather than merit or collective effort. Social mobility became increasingly difficult. Inequality shaped perceptions of fairness, opportunity, and the legitimacy of the new political order. In many republics, this inequality contributed to political instability, civil unrest, or skepticism toward democratic reforms. While some saw the new freedoms as beneficial, others viewed the transition as a betrayal of the promises of socialism, a sentiment that continues to influence politics across the region today. Cultural life in the post-Soviet space underwent a dramatic transformation during the years immediately following the collapse of the USSR. Under Soviet rule, culture had been shaped, often tightly controlled, by ideological directives. Art, literature, cinema, and music were expected to promote socialist values, celebrate the working class, and avoid content considered subversive, decadent, or politically threatening. Yet even within these constraints, Soviet culture had produced remarkable achievements. When censorship collapsed, cultural expression exploded in multiple directions, creating a landscape of unprecedented artistic freedom, but also deep uncertainty about meaning and identity. Media was one of the first sectors to transform. Newspapers, magazines, and television channels that had once echoed official propaganda now began reporting freely on politics, corruption, social issues, and international events. Investigative journalism flourished, exposing abuses that had been hidden for decades. Independent newspapers and radio stations emerged, introducing diverse political views and fostering public debate. While this newfound media freedom empowered citizens, it also created chaos. Rumors spread rapidly, extremist ideas gained platforms, and misinformation became common. Nevertheless, the media revolution marked a fundamental shift toward openness. Cinema and television embraced themes once forbidden. Filmmakers explored subjects such as Stalinist repression, war trauma, crime, love, religion, and existential uncertainty. Some productions criticized Soviet history, while others mourned its loss. Foreign films, Hollywood blockbusters, European art films, Asian cinema flooded the market, exposing audiences to global culture. Music also underwent radical change. Western rock, pop, punk, and electronic music, once circulated underground, became mainstream. Local artists experimented with new genres, mixing traditional styles with modern influences. Nightlife scenes expanded, and cultural creativity flourished. Literature experienced a renaissance as previously banned authors, including Solzhenitsyn, Bulgakov, Grossman, and countless others, returned to the public sphere. Writers grappled with the complexities of transition, exploring themes of identity, morality, loss, and rebirth. Many works became best-selling sensations as readers sought understanding in uncertain times. Daily life shifted as well. Fashion changed rapidly, influenced by Western trends. Young people expressed themselves through clothing, hairstyles, and music in ways unimaginable under Soviet norms. Consumer culture emerged, with advertisements appearing on billboards, buses, and television. People embraced new holidays, personal celebrations, and forms of entertainment. Yet this cultural openness also created tensions. Generational divides widened. Traditionalists worried about the loss of moral values. National identity debates intensified as republics revived cultural symbols, languages, and historical figures previously suppressed. Overall, the cultural transformation of the post-Soviet era reflected a broader societal struggle to define meaning after the collapse of a powerful ideological system. It was a period of creativity, confusion, renewal, and rediscovery, one that continues to influence the cultural landscapes of the former Soviet republics today. Western rock, pop, punk, and electronic music, once circulated underground, became mainstream. Local artists experimented with new genres, mixing traditional styles with modern influences. Nightlife scenes expanded, and cultural creativity flourished. Literature experienced a renaissance as previously banned authors, including Solzhenitsyn, Bulgakov, Grossman, and countless others, returned to the public sphere. Writers grappled with the complexities of transition, exploring themes of identity, morality, loss, and rebirth. Many works became best-selling sensations as readers sought understanding in uncertain times. Daily life shifted as well. Fashion changed rapidly, influenced by Western trends. Young people expressed themselves through clothing, hairstyles, and music in ways unimaginable under Soviet norms. Consumer culture emerged, with advertisements appearing on billboards, buses, and television. People embraced new holidays, personal celebrations, and forms of entertainment. Yet this cultural openness also created tensions. Generational divides widened. Traditionalists worried about the loss of moral values. National identity debates intensified as republics revived cultural symbols, languages, and historical figures previously suppressed. Overall, the cultural transformation of the post-Soviet era reflected a broader societal struggle to define meaning after the collapse of a powerful ideological system. It was a period of creativity, confusion, renewal, and rediscovery, one that continues to influence the cultural landscapes of the former Soviet republics today. The collapse of the Soviet Union left Russia in a political vacuum that demanded rapid reorganization. Institutions that had existed for decades vanished almost overnight, leaving new Russian authorities with a monumental task of creating a functioning political system from scratch. Boris Yeltsin, elected as the first president of the Russian Federation just months before the USSR dissolved, found himself at the center of this transformation. His role was not merely administrative. He was expected to guide a nation through an unprecedented rebirth, to create new power structures, and to stabilize society amid severe social and economic turmoil. One of Yeltsin's first challenges was defining the role of the presidency itself. Under Soviet governance, the concept of a powerful, democratically elected executive had no precedent. Yeltsin sought broad executive authority to enact radical reforms without obstruction. He framed the new presidency as the engine of modernization, insisting that strong leadership was essential to move Russia away from centralized planning and toward a market economy. However, this push for presidential power clashed with the old Soviet-era legislature, the Supreme Soviet of Russia, and the Congress of People's Deputies. These bodies, elected under Soviet rules before the transition, contained many politicians who opposed Yeltsin's rapid reforms and feared the rise of authoritarianism under a new executive. The resulting power struggle shaped Russian politics throughout the early 1990s. Yeltsin attempted to bypass legislative obstruction through presidential decrees, a move that provoked accusations of constitutional violation. Legislators argued that Yeltsin's reforms were reckless, destabilizing, and harmful to ordinary citizens already suffering from economic collapse. Meanwhile, Yeltsin argued that the parliament was dominated by reactionaries who wanted to reverse reforms and restore elements of the old Soviet system. This deadlock underscored the deeper ideological rifts dividing Russian society. One side advocating rapid transformation toward Western-style democracy and capitalism, and the other seeking to preserve social guarantees, state control, and elements of the Soviet political structure. Amid these tensions, Yeltsin set out to draft a new constitution that would replace the remnants of the Soviet legal framework. His vision called for a presidential republic with strong executive powers. Opponents, fearing dictatorship, pushed for a parliamentary system with greater checks on presidential authority. The constitutional struggle became one of the central political battles of the post-Soviet transition, as economic reforms led to rising inequality, unemployment, and widespread dissatisfaction. The conflict between the president and parliament intensified dramatically. The political vacuum of the early post-Soviet era thus became an arena of competing visions for Russia's future. Yeltsin positioned himself as the architect of a modern democratic state, but critics accused him of using democratic legitimacy to consolidate executive power. The institutions he created during this period, an empowered presidency, a weakened parliament, and a political system dependent on individual authority, would shape Russian governance for decades, laying the foundation for the political structure that eventually emerged in the 21st century. The political tensions between Boris Yeltsin and the Russian parliament escalated steadily through 1992 and 1993, culminating in one of the most dramatic and consequential confrontations in modern Russian history, the 1993 constitutional crisis. This confrontation would determine not only the nature of the Russian state, but also the balance of power between its executive and legislative branches, a balance that continues to influence Russian politics decades later. By early 1993, relations between Yeltsin and the parliament had deteriorated into open hostility. The parliament opposed many of Yeltsin's economic reforms, arguing that shock therapy had led to hyperinflation, mass poverty, and the enrichment of a small elite. Yeltsin's use of presidential decrees to implement his agenda angered legislators who felt he was usurping their authority. The parliament, led by Speaker Ruslan Kospolatov and Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, accused Yeltsin of violating the Constitution. Yeltsin, in turn, accused the parliament of sabotaging reforms and attempting to reverse the transition to democracy. The crisis reached its breaking point on September 21st, 1993, when Yeltsin issued Decree number 1400, dissolving the parliament and calling for new elections and a constitutional referendum. The move was legally dubious under the existing Soviet-era constitution, and Parliament declared Yeltsin's actions unconstitutional. In response, legislators voted to impeach Yeltsin and appointed Rutskoy as acting president. Russia now had two competing governments claiming legitimacy. Supporters of Yeltsin gathered around the Kremlin, while the parliament barricaded itself inside the White House, the same building defended by Yeltsin during the 1991 coup. Armed groups loyal to the parliament clashed with police. For days, Moscow teetered on the edge of civil war. Tensions erupted into violence on October 3rd to 4th, when armed supporters of the parliament attempted to seize the Ostankino television center and other key locations. Yeltsin ordered military units to restore control, marking a decisive turning point in the crisis. On October 4th, 1993, Yeltsin authorized tanks to shell the White House, a shocking image that echoed the trauma of past Soviet crises, yet marked the first time in modern Russian history that military force was used by a democratically elected leader against another branch of government. The shelling forced the parliament's defenders to surrender. Kospolatov, Rutskoy, and other leaders were arrested. The crisis ended in Yeltsin's favor, but at a high political and moral cost. Following the confrontation, Yeltsin pushed through a new constitution, approved by referendum in December 1993. This constitution created a strong presidential system with extensive executive powers, limited parliamentary oversight, and centralized authority. While intended to stabilize the nation during a turbulent era, the document also laid the foundation for future leaders to exercise broad, sometimes unchecked power. The 1993 crisis thus represented a pivotal moment. It ended the struggle between competing visions of governance and solidified the presidential system that continues to define Russia today. The economic transition of the early 1990s not only reshaped Russian markets, but also transformed the country's political landscape through the rise of a powerful new elite, the oligarchs. These were businessmen, many of whom had ties to Soviet-era enterprises, criminal networks, or the underground economy, who accumulated extraordinary wealth and influence during the privatization process initiated under Boris Yeltsin. Their rise marked a profound shift in Russian power structures, replacing the Communist Party's bureaucratic elite with a capitalist class capable of influencing both economic policy and political decision-making. One of the most important mechanisms of this transformation was the voucher privatization program. The idea behind the program was to distribute shares of state-owned enterprises to the population, giving every citizen a stake in the national economy. In practice, however, most citizens struggling with poverty, inflation, and daily survival sold their vouchers cheaply to speculators and emerging businessmen. These individuals, often with connections to state officials or criminal groups, accumulated massive shares in valuable industries: oil, gas, mining, banking, telecommunications, and manufacturing. Within a few years, they had transformed into some of the wealthiest people in the world. The Loans for Shares scheme of 1995 accelerated this process. In this arrangement, The government borrowed money from private banks owned by emerging oligarchs. As collateral, the state offered shares in major enterprises. When the government inevitably failed to repay the loans, these shares transferred to the bankers, giving them ownership of Russia's most profitable industries at a fraction of their real value. This system created a small group of immensely powerful individuals who controlled vast economic empires and wielded enormous political influence. Yeltsin, facing declining popularity, relied heavily on these oligarchs for political support. They funded his 1996 presidential campaign, shaped media coverage, and used their resources to influence public opinion. In return, Yeltsin's administration allowed them to expand their economic empires and maintain preferential access to state contracts and political connections. This symbiotic relationship strengthened Yeltsin's position, but also weakened democratic institutions. The line between business and government blurred, and corruption became deeply embedded in the political system. The rise of the oligarchs had far-reaching consequences. On one hand, they played a crucial role in stabilizing parts of the economy by keeping key industries operational during a chaotic period. On the other hand, their dominance led to widespread inequality, distorted markets, and concentrated power in the hands of a few. Many ordinary citizens viewed them as symbols of injustice, individuals who had enriched themselves at the expense of the nation during its most vulnerable moment. The oligarchic system, born during Yeltsin's presidency, would later become a central factor in Russia's political evolution in the 2000s. Future leaders would confront, manipulate, and ultimately reconfigure this powerful class, using it as both a tool and a target in the struggle to consolidate political authority. But in the early post-Soviet years, the oligarchs embodied the chaotic intersection of capitalism, politics, and personal ambition that defined the transformative and turbulent nature of Russia's transition away from the Soviet system. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the definitive end of the Cold War, a global confrontation that had shaped international politics for nearly half a century. For decades, the world had been divided into two competing blocs: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the socialist East, led by the USSR. Their rivalry extended into every realm: ideology, military strategy, economic competition, cultural influence, and technological advancement. The dissolution of the Soviet Union removed one of the two poles anchoring the global balance of power, creating a strategic vacuum that fundamentally reconfigured the international system. For the first time since World War II, the United States found itself as the sole global superpower, ushering in what analysts call the unipolar moment. In this new geopolitical environment, the U.S. and its allies sought to expand democratic governance, market economies, and multilateral cooperation. Many believe the end of the Cold War signified the triumph of liberal democratic ideals. Scholars like Francis Fukuyama famously suggested that humanity had reached the end of history, meaning that Western-style liberal democracy had become the ultimate model for political organization. Western institutions such as NATO, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank increased their influence, helping guide the political and economic transitions of former communist states. Russia and the newly independent republics faced the challenge of redefining their positions within this new global order. Russia, weakened by economic collapse and political instability, shifted from its historic role as a superpower to a state struggling for internal cohesion and international relevance. Its military strength remained significant, especially its nuclear arsenal, but its economic and political capacities were severely diminished. The U.S. and Western powers, seeing Russia's weakened condition, pursued policies to encourage integration with the West offering financial aid, diplomatic recognition, and support for democratic reforms. However, this period also planted the seeds for future tensions. Some Russians felt humiliated by the loss of global status and believed the West exploited Russia's weakness to shape the post-Cold War order without regard for Russian interests. Meanwhile, many former Soviet republics embraced newfound diplomatic and strategic freedom. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, rapidly oriented themselves toward Europe, seeking membership in the EU and NATO. Central European and Eastern European countries that had been under Soviet influence also moved decisively toward Western alliances. This expansion of Western political and military structures reshaped regional security, creating new dynamics that would influence relations between Russia and the West for decades. In Asia, China watched the collapse of the USSR carefully, drawing lessons about political control and economic reform. Chinese leaders concluded that economic modernization could succeed without political liberalization, shaping China's gradual rise as a major global power. The end of the Cold War also allowed regional conflicts previously suppressed by superpower dynamics to re-emerge, including tensions in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Thus, the end of the Cold War did not mark the end of global conflict, but rather the beginning of a new geopolitical era, one dominated by American influence, the spread of Western institutions, the rise of new regional powers, and the long-term challenge of integrating or managing the post-Soviet world. The disappearance of the USSR reshaped global power structures, set new diplomatic priorities, and redefined the strategic landscape for the 21st century. One of the most significant and contentious developments of the post-Soviet era was the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. During the Cold War, NATO had existed as a military alliance designed to counterbalance Soviet power and deter potential aggression. Many nations in Eastern Europe were part of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led military bloc. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991, these countries suddenly found themselves without the security guarantees that had been imposed on them for decades. With newfound sovereignty and the threat of regional instability, many Eastern European states viewed NATO membership as essential for ensuring their safety, stability, and integration into Western institutions. By the mid-1990s, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, nations once firmly within the Soviet sphere, began lobbying for membership in NATO. Their motivations were clear. They wanted protection from the possibility of renewed Russian dominance, access to Western military standards, and a firm path toward economic and political integration with Europe. NATO, for its part, saw expansion as an opportunity to promote stability and democracy across a region undergoing dramatic political changes. The alliance justified expansion on the grounds of collective security, arguing that a more unified Europe would reduce the risks of conflict. However, the expansion of NATO was viewed very differently in Russia. Russian leaders, regardless of political background, saw it as a violation of understandings made during the negotiations surrounding German reunification. While the exact details of these discussions remain debated, many in Russia believe that Western powers had implicitly promised not to expand NATO eastward. As NATO welcomed new members, first in 1999, then in 2004, and in subsequent years, Russian resentment grew. Russian political figures argued that NATO had shifted from a defensive alliance to an organization expanding aggressively toward Russia's borders. This perception contributed to rising geopolitical tensions and influenced Russian foreign policy for decades. The NATO expansion issue intersected with other security concerns. Newly independent states, such as Ukraine and Georgia, sought closer ties with NATO, hoping to secure their sovereignty against potential Russian pressure. Their aspirations fueled further tensions, particularly as Russia viewed such moves as direct threats. The conflict in Georgia in 2008 and later events in Ukraine revealed how deeply NATO expansion influenced the geopolitical dynamics between Russia and the Western world. For former Soviet republics, the choice of security alignment became a defining aspect of their new national identities. Baltic nations embraced NATO wholeheartedly, seeing the alliance as essential for their protection and integration. Central Asian republics balanced between Russian influence and their own regional priorities, while nations in the Caucasus navigated a complex landscape shaped by local conflicts and great power competition. Ultimately, NATO expansion reshaped the post-Soviet world by drawing clear lines of alignment. It solidified the West's influence in Eastern Europe, challenged Russia's sense of regional dominance, and created long-term strategic fractures. These developments foreshadowed future conflicts and remain central to understanding the geopolitical tensions of the 21st century. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, 15 newly independent states emerged, each tasked with rediscovering and redefining its national identity. For decades, Soviet ideology had attempted to create a unified Soviet people, minimizing ethnic distinctions while promoting Russian language and culture across the republics. This strategy often suppressed local traditions, languages, and historical memories. When the USSR dissolved, these republics were suddenly free to reclaim identities that had been marginalized or distorted under Soviet rule. The process was complex, emotional, and transformative, reshaping social dynamics, political systems, and cultural life across the region. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, identity revival was swift and powerful. These nations had strong historical memories of independence before their annexation by the Soviet Union. Upon regaining sovereignty, they quickly restored their pre-Soviet symbols, languages, and cultural practices. Soviet-era monuments were removed, streets were renamed, and national histories were rewritten to reflect local perspectives. The Baltic governments prioritized integration with Europe, framing themselves as part of the Western cultural and political sphere rather than a former Soviet space. This identity shift was reinforced through educational reforms, media, and international diplomacy. Ukraine's identity revival was more complex because of the country's ethnic diversity, linguistic divisions, and varied historical experiences. Nevertheless, the referendum of 1991 demonstrated that a majority of Ukrainians supported independence. Cultural revival efforts included the promotion of the Ukrainian language, reinterpretation of national history, and recognition of previously suppressed events such as the Holodomor. Over time, debates about identity became intertwined with political alignments between those who favored closer ties with Europe and those who advocated for deeper relations with Russia. These divisions would shape Ukrainian politics long after independence. In the Caucasus, national identity revival intersected with long-standing ethnic and territorial conflicts. Armenia embraced its ancient cultural heritage and Christian identity, while Azerbaijan highlighted Turkic roots and connections with the broader Muslim world. Georgia revived narratives of independence, monarchy, and national resilience. However, these identity revivals also fueled tensions in regions like Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, where competing claims over territory and ethnicity erupted into violence. Central Asian republics faced their own challenges. Nations such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan balanced traditional cultural identities with Soviet-influenced modernization. Leaders promoted national languages, revived historical symbols, and emphasized pre-Russian heritage. At the same time, Soviet-era elites often remained in power, creating political continuity despite cultural transformation. Islam regained prominence in many Central Asian societies, influencing social norms and cultural expression. In Belarus, the revival of national identity was slower and more contested. Historical ties with both Russia and Europe created a dual identity that shaped political debates. Some sought to revive Belarusian language and culture, while others favored close integration with Russia. The rediscovery of national identity was not simply a cultural process, it was deeply political. Governments used identity narratives to legitimize their authority, unify their populations, and differentiate themselves from neighbors. Citizens engaged in cultural revival as a way to reclaim dignity, autonomy, and historical truth after decades of Soviet rule. This identity renaissance created rich cultural diversity, but also introduced new political tensions, contested borders, and struggles over historical memory. In the decades after the collapse of the USSR, these identity movements continued to evolve, influencing domestic politics, foreign policy, and regional alliances. They remained central to understanding the complex and dynamic landscape of the former Soviet world. The collapse of the Soviet Union unleashed a wave of ethnic tensions that had been suppressed, frozen, or artificially managed by Moscow for decades. The USSR had projected an image of harmonious coexistence among its more than 100 ethnic groups. But beneath this surface lay deep grievances rooted in historical conflicts, forced migrations, unequal development, and political manipulation. When a central authority that had maintained order weakened and then disappeared, these tensions erupted into conflicts that reshaped the post-Soviet world. The early 1990s became one of the most turbulent periods in the region's modern history, as unresolved ethnic disputes fueled wars, uprisings, and population displacements. One of the most significant flashpoints was Nagorno-Karabakh, an ethnically Armenian enclave within Azerbaijan. Tensions had been rising since the late 1980s, when Armenians demanded the region's transfer to Armenia. As glasnost allowed public expression of grievances, massive demonstrations broke out. By 1991, full-scale war had erupted between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces. Villages were destroyed, civilians were displaced, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The conflict created one of the first major humanitarian crises of the post-Soviet era and would continue intermittently for decades, shaping the political identities of both nations. In Georgia, ethnic tensions triggered multiple conflicts. The regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, each with distinct cultural and political identities, resisted integration into the Georgian state. Georgian nationalism, fueled by the broader independence movement, clashed with the separatist aspirations of these regions. Violence erupted shortly after Georgia's independence. Abkhazia's conflict became particularly brutal, with widespread displacement and allegations of ethnic cleansing. South Ossetia experienced armed clashes as well, eventually leading to ceasefires that left both regions in political limbo. Territories nominally part of Georgia, but effectively independent with support from Russia. Moldova faced similar challenges in Transnistria, a narrow strip of land along the Dniester River with a significant Russian-speaking population. As Moldova pursued policies promoting Romanian language and cultural identity, Transnistrian authorities feared marginalization and declared secession. Armed conflict followed in 1992, involving Moldovan forces, local militias, and the intervention of Russian troops. A ceasefire eventually froze the conflict, leaving Transnistria unrecognized internationally, but functioning as a de facto independent state, a situation that persists today. Central Asia experienced its own share of turmoil. The Tajik Civil War, 1992 to 1997, represented one of the bloodiest post-Soviet conflicts. Fought between government forces, Islamist factions, pro-democracy groups, and regional warlords, the conflict resulted from deep political fragmentation and socioeconomic inequalities that had been masked under Soviet rule. Hundreds of thousands were displaced and tens of thousands died. The instability extended beyond Tajikistan's borders, influencing regional security and drawing in external actors such as Russia and Uzbekistan. These conflicts revealed a central truth about the post-Soviet space. The Soviet Union had maintained unity not through resolving ethnic and territorial disputes, but through suppressing them. Once the suppressive force disappeared, long-standing grievances resurfaced with explosive consequences. The violence of the early 1990s shattered the illusion of a peaceful post-Soviet transition and demonstrated the fragility of borders drawn by Soviet authorities. These ethnic conflicts reshaped national identities, hardened political positions, and created unresolved disputes that continue to affect regional stability to this day. Among the most violent and consequential conflicts in the post-Soviet era were the two Chechen Wars, which unfolded in the mid-1990s and early 2000s. Chechnya, a small republic in the North Caucasus with a long history of resistance to Russian imperial expansion, declared independence in 1991 under the leadership of Jakhar Dudayev. While many former Soviet republics successfully achieved sovereignty, Moscow viewed Chechnya's declaration as an unacceptable challenge to Russian territorial integrity. The Kremlin feared that allowing Chechnya to secede would embolden other regions seeking independence, potentially leading to the fragmentation of the Russian Federation itself. The First Chechen War began in December 1994, when Russian forces launched a large-scale military operation to regain control of the republic. Russian leaders believed the campaign would be quick and decisive. Instead, the conflict became a quagmire. Chechen fighters, familiar with the mountainous terrain and supported by a population fiercely committed to independence, resisted with remarkable effectiveness. The Russian army, still reeling from post-Soviet disorganization, struggled with poor training, low morale, and inadequate leadership. The battle for Grozny, Chechnya's capital, became one of the most destructive urban battles in modern history, resulting in heavy civilian casualties and widespread devastation. Media coverage of the war, unprecedented in its openness, exposed the brutality of the conflict to the Russian public. Images of bombed neighborhoods, refugee columns, and grieving families eroded support for the war and damaged the credibility of Boris Yeltsin's government. By 1996, the conflict reached a stalemate. A peace agreement signed in Kosovo ended the fighting and granted Chechnya de facto independence without resolving its legal status. Russia withdrew its forces, but the republic fell into chaos, suffering from internal divisions, warlordism, and the rise of extremist groups. The Second Chechen War began in 1999, following a series of violent incidents, including apartment bombings in Russian cities and a Chechen-led incursion into neighboring Dagestan that the Kremlin attributed to Chechen militants. The war began under the leadership of Russia's new prime minister, Vladimir Putin, who adopted a far more aggressive and uncompromising strategy. Russian forces launched a massive assault on Grozny, ultimately recapturing the city after another devastating urban battle. Unlike the First War, this conflict ended with Chechnya brought back under Moscow's control, although reconstruction took years and the region remained deeply unstable. The Chechen Wars had lasting implications for Russia and the broader post-Soviet space. They reshaped Russia's internal politics, strengthened the role of security forces, and elevated Putin's popularity as a leader capable of restoring order. The wars also contributed to the rise of separatist, Islamist, and militant movements across the Caucasus, leading to years of insurgency and counterinsurgency operations. Internationally, the conflicts drew criticism for human rights abuses, civilian casualties, and the harsh tactics used by Russian forces. Ultimately, the Chechen Wars symbolized the struggle between national self-determination and state sovereignty, a struggle that would influence Russia's approach to regional conflicts and its relations with former Soviet republics for decades. Beyond the major wars, the former Soviet Union became riddled with frozen conflicts, unresolved territorial disputes that remained in limbo, neither fully active nor fully resolved. These conflicts emerged from ethnic tensions, political grievances, and power struggles that had roots in the Soviet period. When the USSR collapsed, these disputes erupted, but ceasefires often froze the lines of control without addressing underlying issues. The result was a patchwork of unrecognized or partially recognized territories that became sources of long-term instability in the region. Transnistria in Moldova is one of the most durable examples. After the brief 1992 war, the region established its own government, military, and institutions supported politically and militarily by Russia. Although no major international body recognizes Transnistria as an independent state, it functions as one in practice. The unresolved status hinders Moldova's political development and complicates its aspirations for deeper integration with Europe. In the Caucasus, Abkhazia and South Ossetia broke away from Georgia in the early 1990s, each supported by Russia. Both regions established de facto independent governments after violent conflicts. Georgia considers them occupied territories, while Russia recognizes them as independent states following the 2008 Russo-Georgian War. These unresolved disputes continue to disrupt regional security and fuel geopolitical tensions between Russia and Western nations. Nagorno-Karabakh remained one of the most volatile frozen conflicts. Although Armenians held control of the region and surrounding territories after the early 1990s war, Azerbaijan refused to accept this outcome. The region existed in a state of tense ceasefire, with frequent skirmishes and growing militarization on both sides. Decades of frustration culminated in the 2020 war, in which Azerbaijan, backed by modern weaponry and strategic support from regional partners, regained significant territory. The conflict demonstrated how frozen disputes can reignite with devastating consequences. Other lesser-known frozen conflicts exist as well. In Central Asia, border disputes between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, rooted in Soviet-era territorial divisions, continue to flare up periodically, sometimes resulting in deadly clashes. In Russia's North Caucasus, various separatist and Islamist movements remained active long after the Chechen Wars, destabilizing regions such as Dagestan and Ingushetia. Frozen conflicts serve several purposes for the actors involved. For Russia, these disputes act as levers of influence over neighboring states, preventing them from fully integrating with Western institutions like NATO or the EU. For local authorities in breakaway regions, unresolved status allows political elites to maintain power without accountability. But for millions of people living in these territories, frozen conflicts mean insecurity, limited economic opportunities, and uncertain futures. The persistence of frozen conflicts underscores one of the central truths of the post-Soviet space. The collapse of the USSR did not simply free nations. It also unmasked decades of unresolved tensions that would continue to shape regional politics for generations. These conflicts, neither fully alive nor fully dead, remain among the most enduring legacies of the Soviet Union's dissolution. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Eastern Europe found itself free from Moscow's domination for the first time in nearly half a century. The nations of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, later the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and others had already begun pushing back against Soviet influence in the late 1980s. However, the definitive end of the USSR opened a new chapter in which these states had to build democratic institutions, redefine their sovereignty, and overcome decades of centralized rule. Political rebirth proved both inspiring and immensely challenging, as societies that had lived under authoritarianism now struggled to construct democratic systems from the ground up. In many countries, the enthusiasm for independence and democracy ran high. Citizens organized political movements, held free elections, and drafted new constitutions. Poland's Solidarity movement, a catalyst of regional change, helped usher in a new era of pluralistic politics. Hungary implemented sweeping reforms to dismantle communist structures and encourage political participation. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution showcased the power of peaceful protest, bringing Václav Havel, a dissident playwright, to the presidency. These transitions reflected deep societal hunger for freedom, human rights, and political accountability. However, the shift to democracy was not simply a matter of holding elections. Countries had to construct functioning legislatures, courts, regulatory systems, and civil institutions. Decades of centralized control had weakened local governance, suppressed independent media, and discouraged political innovation. Citizens who had never participated in political life now had to navigate these unfamiliar systems. Bureaucracies had to be reformed, often with limited resources. Corruption, inherited from dysfunctional state structures, emerged as a serious threat to democratic development. Political parties fractured and multiplied, sometimes creating unstable coalition governments. Parliaments struggled to balance bold reform agendas with public expectations and economic constraints. Moreover, democratic transition required confronting painful historical legacies. Many nations sought to reveal the truth about collaboration with communist secret police, political repression, and censorship. Opening secret archives forced societies to confront difficult questions about guilt, complicity, and forgiveness. Some individuals who had held minor roles in the former regimes argued that they had acted under pressure or simply followed orders to survive. Victims of political persecution demanded justice. Governments implemented lustration policies, screening officials for ties to communist security services, but these processes sparked intense debate about fairness, accountability, and political revenge. Despite these challenges, Eastern Europe achieved one of the most successful democratization waves of the 20th century. While imperfections remained, these nations laid foundations that would guide their political evolution for decades. Their experiences demonstrated that rebuilding democracy after authoritarianism is neither linear nor simple, but possible through societal commitment, institutional reform, and international support. The political rebirth of Eastern Europe became a defining feature of the post-Soviet era and a central element of the continent's transformation. Corruption, inherited from dysfunctional state structures, emerged as a serious threat to democratic development. Political parties fractured and multiplied, sometimes creating unstable coalition governments. Parliaments struggled to balance bold reform agendas with public expectations and economic constraints. Moreover, Democratic transition required confronting painful historical legacies. Many nations sought to reveal the truth about collaboration with communist secret police, political repression, and censorship. Opening secret archives forced societies to confront difficult questions about guilt, complicity, and forgiveness. Some individuals who had held minor roles in the former regimes argued that they had acted under pressure or simply followed orders to survive. Victims of political persecution demanded justice. Governments implemented lustration policies, screening officials for ties to communist security services, but these processes sparked intense debate about fairness, accountability, and political revenge. Despite these challenges, Eastern Europe achieved one of the most successful democratization waves of the 20th century. While imperfections remained, these nations laid foundations that would guide their political evolution for decades. Their experiences demonstrated that rebuilding democracy after authoritarianism is neither linear nor simple, but possible through societal commitment, institutional reform, and international support. The political rebirth of Eastern Europe became a defining feature of the post-Soviet era and a central element of the continent's transformation. Alongside political transformation, Eastern Europe faced the monumental task of rebuilding its economies. Under communism, economic systems in the region have been centrally planned, dependent on Soviet energy supplies, and integrated into the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. Factories were inefficient, consumer goods were scarce, and industries operated without competition or market incentives. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Comecon collapsed with it, leaving Eastern European economies without their traditional markets and supply chains. Nations that had long relied on Moscow for energy, raw materials, and financial subsidies suddenly found themselves disconnected from an unsustainable economic system. To survive, Eastern European states embarked on ambitious economic transformations. Many follow the model of shock therapy, rapid market liberalization intended to dismantle socialist structures quickly. Prices were freed, currencies were stabilized, trade barriers were removed, and state-owned enterprises were privatized. The goal was to create market economies that could integrate seamlessly with Western Europe. While necessary, these reforms came with enormous short-term costs. Inflation surged, unemployment rose, and industries collapsed under competitive pressure. Millions of workers lost their jobs, and many families fell into poverty. Social safety nets, once guaranteed by the socialist state, were often unable to handle the scale of economic hardship. However, the long-term benefits of these reforms were significant. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Eastern European economies began stabilizing and modernizing. Foreign investment poured in, attracted by low labor costs, strategic geographic locations, and reform-friendly governments. Industries such as automotive manufacturing, technology, finance, and services expanded rapidly. Countries rebuilt infrastructure, modernized telecommunications, and established competitive markets. Tourism surged and entrepreneurial sectors flourished. Integration into the European Union played a crucial role in accelerating this transformation. EU membership required strict adherence to political and economic standards, rule of law, transparency, stable markets, and democratic governance. Preparing for accession pushed countries to adopt reforms that improved regulatory frameworks, protected property rights, and strengthened institutions. Nations such as Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the Baltic states benefited tremendously from EU structural funds, which supported development projects, education, and modernization initiatives. The transition, however, was not without controversy. Critics argued that rapid privatization enriched a small elite and left many citizens without economic security. Some industries never recovered from the shock of competition. Regional disparities widened, with urban centers prospering while rural areas lagged behind. Nevertheless, compared to other parts of the former Soviet space, Eastern Europe achieved remarkable economic progress, transforming from stagnant socialist economies into dynamic, globally integrated markets. This economic renaissance became one of the defining success stories of the post-Soviet era. Eastern Europe demonstrated that rapid transformation, while painful, could lead to long-term prosperity, provided that reforms were paired with strong institutions, democratic governance, and integration with stable international economic systems. The end of communist rule also unleashed a cultural and social revival across Eastern Europe. For decades, national traditions, religious practices, and artistic expression have been constrained by ideological boundaries imposed by socialist governments. Censorship limited creativity, suppressed dissent, and shaped public discourse. With the collapse of these regimes, societies underwent a profound cultural transformation, rediscovering identities that had been muted or distorted for generations. Religion was one of the most visible areas of revival. Churches that had been surveilled, restricted, or co-opted by communist authorities quickly regained influence. In Poland, the Catholic Church played a central role in supporting democratic activism and continued to shape the nation's cultural and moral landscape. In Romania and Bulgaria, Orthodox Christianity experienced a resurgence as citizens sought spiritual meaning after decades of ideological control. New freedoms allowed religious institutions to rebuild their communities, restore traditions, and reclaim historical roles in education and social services. Language and heritage also regained prominence. Censorship had often discouraged studies of national history, literature, and folklore, emphasizing Soviet narratives instead. After independence, schools, universities, and cultural organizations rewrote curricula to reflect local perspectives. Monuments were restored, national holidays reintroduced, and historical memory re-examined. Figures once condemned or ignored under communist rule, writers, intellectuals, political leaders, were re-evaluated and celebrated. This process of historical recovery strengthened national identity, but also sparked debates over how to interpret controversial or traumatic past events. The arts flourished in an atmosphere of newfound freedom. Filmmakers tackled previously forbidden subjects, such as political repression, corruption, and personal trauma. Writers explored themes of memory, identity, and disillusionment. Music scenes evolved rapidly, blending local traditions with global influences. Young artists experimented with genres that had been discouraged under communism, from punk and rock to electronic music and avant-garde performance. Visual arts also expanded, with galleries showcasing innovative works that reflected social change, political commentary, and personal expression. Media transformation played a key role in shaping public consciousness. Independent newspapers, television stations, and radio networks emerged, offering diverse viewpoints and investigative journalism. Citizens gained access to global information networks, Western broadcasts, and the expanding world of the internet. This media freedom empowered society, although it also introduced challenges: commercialization, sensationalism, and political influence over media outlets. Everyday life changed as well. Consumer culture expanded, bringing new goods, fashion, entertainment, and lifestyles. Young people embraced global trends while rediscovering local traditions. Travel opportunities increased dramatically, allowing citizens to visit Western Europe and beyond, gaining exposure to new ideas and experiences. These cultural exchanges reinforced the sense that Eastern Europe was rejoining the broader European community after decades of isolation. The social and cultural revival of Eastern Europe was not always smooth. Identity debates emerged, often tied to nationalism, integration, and globalization. Some communities struggled to balance tradition with modernity or to reconcile competing narratives of history. Yet overall, the post-communist cultural transformation represented a powerful assertion of freedom, creativity, and identity. It symbolized the region's determination to shape its own destiny, independent of Soviet domination. The collapse of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves through China's political leadership. For the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, the fall of its ideological sibling was not a distant geopolitical curiosity. It was a direct warning. China and the USSR had once shared a revolutionary vision, rooted in Marxism-Leninism and one-party rule. Although relations between the two states had deteriorated during the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s, their political systems still had structural similarities. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, the CCP realized it could face the same fate if it failed to understand the causes of the Soviet collapse. Thus, Chinese leaders embarked on a comprehensive analysis, examining what had gone wrong in the USSR and how China could avoid similar outcomes. One of the major conclusions drawn by the CCP was that the Soviet Union had lost ideological discipline. After decades of stagnation, corruption, and political rigidity, Soviet leaders had failed to maintain the ideological legitimacy of communism. Gorbachev's reforms, particularly glasnost, were seen by Beijing as dangerously destabilizing. They believed that allowing political pluralism, free criticism of the Communist Party, and open historical reassessment had undermined the ideological foundation of the Soviet state, weakening the population's loyalty to the party. Chinese leaders argued that once the Communist Party's authority came under open attack from within, the system became vulnerable to collapse. Therefore, they concluded that ideological control must remain uncompromising. Yet overall, the post-communist cultural transformation represented a powerful assertion of freedom, creativity, and identity. It symbolized the region's determination to shape its own destiny, independent of Soviet domination. The collapse of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves through China's political leadership. For the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, the fall of its ideological sibling was not a distant geopolitical curiosity. It was a direct warning. China and the USSR had once shared a revolutionary vision, rooted in Marxism-Leninism and one-party rule. Although relations between the two states had deteriorated during the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s, their political systems still had structural similarities. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, the CCP realized it could face the same fate if it failed to understand the causes of the Soviet collapse. Thus, Chinese leaders embarked on a comprehensive analysis, examining what had gone wrong in the USSR and how China could avoid similar outcomes. One of the major conclusions drawn by the CCP was that the Soviet Union had lost ideological discipline. After decades of stagnation, corruption, and political rigidity, Soviet leaders had failed to maintain the ideological legitimacy of communism. Gorbachev's reforms, particularly glasnost, were seen by Beijing as dangerously destabilizing. They believed that allowing political pluralism, free criticism of the Communist Party, and open historical reassessment had undermined the ideological foundation of the Soviet state, weakening the population's loyalty to the party. Chinese leaders argued that once the Communist Party's authority came under open attack from within, the system became vulnerable to collapse. Therefore, they concluded that ideological control must remain uncompromising. Another perceived mistake was the Soviet leadership's loss of control over the military and security apparatus. During the late 1980s, tensions between the KGB, the military and the political leadership weakened internal cohesion. The failed August 1991 coup reflected this fragmentation. In China's view, the Communist Party must always retain absolute control over the armed forces and internal security institutions. This principle was reaffirmed repeatedly in Chinese political doctrine. The party commands the gun. The Soviet model was cited as an example of what happens when military and political authority drift apart. The CCP also concluded that economic stagnation and consumer dissatisfaction had eroded Soviet public support. While the Soviet Union possessed vast resources, its economy became increasingly inefficient, uncompetitive, and unresponsive to citizens' needs. By contrast, China had already begun market-oriented reforms under Deng Xiaoping, focusing on economic growth, private enterprise, and foreign investment while maintaining political control. The Soviet experience validated China's approach, prioritizing economic development while strictly limiting political liberalization. Above all, China saw the Soviet collapse as proof that political reform must never outpace economic reform. In the Soviet case, political openness came before economic recovery, leading to chaos, fragmentation, and loss of central authority. For China, the lesson was clear: maintain authoritarian control while modernizing the economy, gradually improving living standards to bolster legitimacy. To reinforce this stability, the CCP increased political education, censored narratives about Soviet failure, and promoted a consistent message: China must not follow the Soviet path. Through this analysis, China not only avoided the fate of the USSR, but redefined its model of governance, one that blended economic dynamism with rigid political control. The Soviet collapse became a foundational cautionary tale, shaping Chinese policy for decades to come. China's economic transformation in the 1980s and 1990s diverged sharply from the Soviet approach. While the USSR attempted political reform, glasnost, before addressing structural economic issues, China prioritized economic modernization first and maintained strict political discipline. The Chinese leadership observed that the Soviet economy had deteriorated long before Gorbachev took power. Central planning had stifled innovation, restricted productivity, and created chronic shortages. However, instead of introducing market reforms early, the USSR delayed restructuring until it was too late. When reforms were finally implemented, they were inconsistent and lacked clear direction, creating confusion rather than stability. China drew the opposite lesson: reform early, reform gradually, and reform strategically. Beginning with Deng Xiaoping's policies, China opened its economy to global markets, encouraged foreign investment, and allowed private enterprise to flourish within controlled limits. Special economic zones, SEZs, became laboratories for experimentation, offering foreign investors tax incentives, lenient regulations, and access to low-cost labor. These zones produced rapid growth and became models for wider reforms. Unlike the Soviet Union, which dismantled the planned economy abruptly, China pursued a hybrid model, combining market mechanisms with state ownership in key industries. This dual-track strategy allowed China to maintain stability during periods of economic transition. The state retained control over major banks, energy companies, telecommunications, and transportation infrastructure. These sectors acted as stabilizing pillars while private businesses expanded in manufacturing, services, and technology. China's careful sequencing avoided the economic collapse seen in post-Soviet countries, where sudden liberalization led to hyperinflation, unemployment, and loss of public confidence. Moreover, the CCP refused to allow political pluralism, viewing it as inherently destabilizing. China watched glasnost with growing alarm, perceiving it as a reckless experiment that encouraged separatism, nationalism, and uncontrolled public dissent. Instead, China tightened censorship, expanded surveillance, and reinforced ideological education. The goal was to create economic dynamism without undermining the party's authority. While limited political reforms occurred, such as term limits, administrative restructuring, and anti-corruption measures, they were always implemented under the party's supervision, not in response to public pressure. China's ability to maintain economic growth while avoiding political fragmentation strengthened its global position. By the late 1990s, China was emerging as a major manufacturing hub, attracting enormous foreign investment. Its economy grew at double-digit rates, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. In contrast, Russia and many former Soviet republics experienced economic hardship, inequality, and political instability. This contrast reinforced China's belief that its political model was superior. The Chinese leadership thus treated the Soviet collapse not just as a historical event, but as a strategic case study. It shaped China's approach to governance, statecraft, and economic management in lasting ways. Through deliberate choices, China avoided the pitfalls that destroyed the Soviet Union and positioned itself as one of the world's rising superpowers in the 21st century. The dissolution of the Soviet Union reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Asia, creating space for China to expand its influence across the region. For decades, the USSR had been a central power in Central Asia, Mongolia, and parts of South Asia. When the Soviet system collapsed, these regions experienced political uncertainty, economic insecurity, and shifting alliances. China recognized an opportunity to build new partnerships, secure its borders, and advance its long-term strategic interests. The result was a gradual but decisive expansion of Chinese influence across the former Soviet sphere. Central Asia was the first arena of strategic engagement. The newly independent nations of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan were rich in natural resources but lacked established political institutions and faced numerous security challenges. China aimed to create stable relations with these countries to prevent regional instability from spilling into its own territory, particularly Xinjiang, which shares borders with several Central Asian states and has its own ethnic tensions. Beijing pursued cooperative agreements on border security, economic development, and counterterrorism. These efforts culminated in the formation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. In 2001, a regional alliance focused on security, trade, and political coordination. The SCO became a cornerstone of China's diplomatic presence in the post-Soviet space. Economic engagement also played a critical role. China invested heavily in infrastructure projects, energy pipelines, mining operations, and transportation networks across Central Asia. These investments aimed to secure access to oil, natural gas, and minerals while creating new trade corridors that linked Central Asia with Chinese markets. Decades later, these efforts would expand into the broader Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a global infrastructure strategy designed to strengthen China's economic and political influence worldwide. China's relationship with Russia also transformed after the Soviet collapse. Initially, both countries viewed each other with suspicion. Russia feared China's rise, while China was wary of Russia's military power. However, mutual strategic interests, opposition to NATO expansion, shared concerns about Western influence, and economic complementarities gradually drove them closer. By the late 1990s, China and Russia had resolved most of their border disputes and began cooperating on economic and military matters. Their partnership would later strengthen into a significant geopolitical alignment in the 21st century. Beyond Central Asia, China cultivated ties with Mongolia, enhancing trade and investment. It also increased engagement with Southeast Asia, strengthening regional diplomacy through organizations such as ASEAN. The collapse of the USSR removed a major strategic competitor in Asia, allowing China to consolidate influence and assert itself as a rising power. In sum, China's response to the Soviet collapse was multifaceted. Ideological vigilance at home, economic reform under tight political control, and strategic expansion abroad. The fall of the USSR reshaped China's worldview and encouraged it to forge a distinctive path, one that avoided Soviet mistakes while capitalizing on new geopolitical opportunities. This strategic realignment would have profound implications for global power dynamics in the decades that followed. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a watershed moment in global history, one that fundamentally altered the balance of power. For decades, the world had been locked in a bipolar struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers competing for ideological, military, and geopolitical influence. When the USSR fell, the United States emerged as the sole remaining superpower, commanding unprecedented global dominance. This unipolar moment shaped the final decade of the 20th century and helped define international relations well into the 21st century. America's strength rested on multiple pillars. Economically, the United States was the world's largest and most dynamic market, driven by technological innovation, consumer spending, and stable institutions. The fall of the USSR removed a major ideological competitor, allowing capitalism and liberal democracy to spread with much less resistance. Politically, the U.S. exerted enormous influence through international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions, originally shaped in the aftermath of World War II, now operated in a world where American leadership faced few meaningful challenges. Militarily, the United States possessed unmatched capabilities. While the Soviet military had been a formidable rival, its collapse left the U.S. with a massive advantage in terms of technology, logistics, naval power, and global reach. The Gulf War of 1991, fought just months before the official end of the USSR, demonstrated the extent of American superiority. Using advanced technology, precision-guided weapons, satellite systems, and coordinated coalition operations, the U.S.-led forces overwhelmed Iraq's military in a matter of weeks. The Gulf War sent a message not only to adversaries, but also to allies. The United States now possessed the ability to project power anywhere on Earth, quickly and decisively. Culturally, the collapse of the Soviet Union amplified American influence around the globe. Hollywood films, music, consumer brands, and media networks penetrated markets in Eastern Europe, Asia, and beyond. Former Soviet states and Eastern European nations looked to the U.S. as a model for modernization, entrepreneurship, and democratic governance. The spread of the Internet, an American creation, further expanded U.S. cultural dominance. Ideas, entertainment, technology, and lifestyle trends moved across borders with remarkable speed, strengthening America's soft power. Yet despite this unchallenged strength, the unipolar world brought new responsibilities and dilemmas. With no major competitor to balance American power, the U.S. found itself increasingly called upon to intervene in global conflicts, maintain international stability, and respond to humanitarian crises. These interventions range from peacekeeping missions in the Balkans to nation-building efforts in Somalia and Haiti. America became the default leader in addressing issues from nuclear proliferation to environmental protection. However, exercising such extensive influence came with risks. Risks that would eventually shape global perceptions of the United States in complex ways. This era of American dominance seemed to confirm, for many, the inevitability of liberal democracy and free market capitalism. But beneath the surface, new geopolitical forces were emerging. China was rising economically. Russia, although weakened, was beginning to rebuild. The Middle East experienced increasing turmoil. Terrorist networks expanded their influence. The unipolar moment was powerful but fragile, creating opportunities and tensions that would define the next chapter of global politics. With the Soviet Union gone, the United States adopted a foreign policy approach that combined idealism, strategic interest, and global responsibility. For American leaders, the post-Cold War period presented an opportunity to shape a new international order based on democratic principles, free markets, and cooperative security arrangements. Many policymakers believe that without the ideological rivalry of the Cold War, the world could move toward greater stability, prosperity, and peace if the United States took an active role in guiding that process. One of the defining elements of U.S. foreign policy during this period was humanitarian intervention. In Somalia, 1992 to 1993, the United States deployed forces to address famine and restore order in a war-torn nation. Although the mission ultimately encountered significant challenges, it reflected America's willingness to engage even in conflicts where traditional national interests were not immediately clear. In Haiti, 1994, the U.S. intervened to restore a democratically elected government and stabilize the country. These missions demonstrated a new belief that American leadership could help prevent atrocities and promote democracy worldwide. The Balkans became a major focus of U.S. intervention during the 1990s. After the breakup of Yugoslavia, ethnic tensions escalated into violent conflicts in Bosnia and later Kosovo. Massacres, ethnic cleansing, and humanitarian crises shocked the world. NATO, led largely by the United States, intervened militarily to stop the violence, first in Bosnia in 1995 and later in Kosovo in 1999. These interventions were controversial but ultimately played decisive roles in ending both wars. The U.S. framed these actions as necessary to uphold human rights, preserve European stability, and demonstrate that genocide would not be tolerated in the post-Cold War world. Beyond military interventions, the United States also pursued diplomatic and economic leadership. The expansion of NATO and the European Union, largely encouraged by American support, helped stabilize Eastern Europe and integrate former communist states into Western institutions. Trade agreements such as NAFTA, 1994, linked the U.S. economy more closely with its neighbors, promoting regional economic growth. American technology companies, Microsoft, IBM, Intel, and later Google and Amazon, spread across the globe, transforming industries and communication networks. However, U.S. foreign policy during this period was not without controversy. Some nations viewed American intervention as overreach or a form of neocolonialism. Critics argued that the U.S. often acted unilaterally, imposing its values without fully understanding local contexts or the long-term consequences of its actions. This growing resentment gradually took root, especially in parts of the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. Nevertheless, the overarching reality of the 1990s was clear. The United States occupied a unique position of global leadership. It shaped international institutions, intervened in regional conflicts, and promoted a vision of a liberal global order. This combination of hard power, soft power, and ideological commitment defined America's role during the post-Soviet era. and laid the groundwork for future foreign policy decisions that would carry significant consequences in the decades ahead. In the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, American cultural influence exploded across the globe with unparalleled momentum. The Cold War had been a competition not only of military strength and ideology, but of culture, whose vision of modern life was more appealing, more dynamic, more promising. With the Soviet model discredited and dismantled, American culture poured into newly open societies, shaping everything from entertainment and technology to fashion, language, and personal aspirations. This expansion of soft power became one of the most defining global trends of the 1990s. Entertainment played a major role in this cultural diffusion. Hollywood movies reached audiences in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Russia with unprecedented speed. Films featuring advanced technology, heroic narratives, and modern urban landscapes offered a vision of a world that seemed exciting, wealthy, and full of possibility. American television shows and music also reached vast new audiences. Genres such as hip-hop, rock, pop, and R&B spread rapidly, influencing young people across continents. MTV, newly available in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, became a symbol of Western culture, style, and youth identity. Consumer culture reinforced this influence. Brands like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Nike, and Levi's jeans entered markets that had previously been closed or tightly regulated. For many citizens of the former Soviet bloc, these products symbolized freedom, prosperity, and modernity. Standing in line at newly opened Western fast food chains or shopping for imported clothes became emblematic of broader social transformation. Advertising, previously scarce or state-controlled, flourished, shaping consumer desires and exposing people to new lifestyles. Language also played a key role. English became the global lingua franca for business, technology, and diplomacy. As former Soviet republics sought integration with global markets, English language education expanded dramatically. Universities introduced new programs. Companies required English proficiency, and media increasingly featured multilingual content. The spread of English further cemented American influence, allowing cultural ideas to circulate widely and shaping how people communicated across borders. Technology amplified this cultural reach even more. The internet, born in American research institutions, became a gateway to global communication. American tech companies dominated early internet infrastructure, programming languages, and online culture. Microsoft Windows became the standard operating system across the world. Later, companies like Google, Amazon, Yahoo, and eBay transformed how people accessed information and conducted business. The digital revolution connected societies in ways unimaginable during the Soviet era. However, this cultural expansion also sparked debates. Critics argued that American influence threatened local cultures, eroding traditions, values, and identities. Some governments attempted to limit Western media or regulate cultural imports, fearing cultural homogenization. Yet despite resistance, American influence remained powerful, shaping global aspirations and norms. People adopted Western fashion trends, embraced capitalist entrepreneurship, and consumed American media at unprecedented levels. The rise of American soft power was not simply a consequence of geopolitical dominance. It was also a cultural phenomenon rooted in creativity, innovation, and mass appeal. It reshaped global identities, influenced political attitudes, and transformed everyday life. Even in regions where American foreign policy faced criticism, American culture often retained widespread popularity, demonstrating the complex and multifaceted nature of soft power. In the years following the Soviet collapse, the United States became not only the world's dominant military and economic power, but also the central cultural force shaping global society. This transformation played a vital role in defining the world order that emerged after 1991 and continues to influence global dynamics today. For decades, the Middle East had been a major theater of Cold War competition. The Soviet Union supported several regional governments, armed nationalist movements, and backed socialist-leaning regimes seeking independence from Western influence. Countries such as Syria, Iraq, South Yemen, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt at various points received Soviet weapons, economic aid, and diplomatic backing. The USSR positioned itself as a protector of Arab nationalism and a counterweight to American alliances with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran before the 1979 revolution. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the power balance in the Middle East shifted dramatically. Without the USSR, many Middle Eastern states suddenly found themselves without a great power patron. Syria, long dependent on Soviet military support, had to adapt to a world where Russia, its successor ally, was economically weak and politically preoccupied with internal crises. While Moscow tried to maintain influence, it no longer possessed the resources to compete with American presence in the region. Iraq under Saddam Hussein faced its own crisis. The Gulf War of 1991 had already weakened Iraq militarily and economically. With the USSR gone, Iraq no longer enjoyed diplomatic protection at the United Nations or access to Soviet weapons systems at previous levels. This isolation contributed to Iraq's further instability, ultimately leading to events in the early 2000s. In Iran, the Soviet collapse had complex consequences. The Islamic Republic had historically distrusted both superpowers, but later developed strategic cooperation with post-Soviet Russia, particularly in the fields of nuclear technology, arms, and energy. The disappearance of the Soviet Union also opened opportunities for Iran to expand influence into newly independent Central Asian republics, sharing religious and cultural ties with countries like Tajikistan. Yet Iran also faced increased U.S. pressure as America's unipolar dominance allowed for a more assertive Middle East policy. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was also reshaped. The Soviet Union had traditionally backed the PLO and supported Arab resistance movements. After the USSR's collapse, Russia retained diplomatic involvement but lacked leverage. In contrast, the United States became the primary mediator, leading to the 1993 Oslo Accords. Many Middle Eastern governments now saw greater strategic benefits in aligning with the United States, which wielded overwhelming military and economic influence. Gulf states expanded military cooperation with Washington, and American troops became a semi-permanent presence in the region following the Gulf War. The absence of a USSR also increased the influence of non-state actors. Groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and later al-Qaeda filled power vacuums created by weakened governments and shifting alliances. These groups were not creations of the post-Soviet era, but their rise accelerated due to regional instability, economic crises, and social fragmentation. Without the balancing force of the Soviet bloc, the Middle East entered an era where non-state actors, militias, insurgent groups, terrorist networks, played a more prominent role in shaping political outcomes. Furthermore, the collapse of the USSR opened new markets across the Middle East for trade, oil partnerships, and weapons sales. New Russian corporations emerged as arms suppliers to Iran, Syria, and other states, re-establishing Russia's regional presence in a different form. Meanwhile, the United States strengthened its alliances, expanding its network of military bases from the Persian Gulf to the Eastern Mediterranean. In summary, The disappearance of the Soviet Union reshaped Middle Eastern geopolitics by removing a major source of support for several governments, increasing U.S. dominance, encouraging the rise of non-state actors, and opening the region to new diplomatic and economic strategies. The resulting instability and power realignments continue to define Middle Eastern politics today. The collapse of the Soviet Union had a profound impact on South Asia, reshaping regional alliances, economic futures, and security dynamics. During the Cold War, India had maintained a close relationship with the Soviet Union, viewing it as a reliable military supplier and political ally. Pakistan, by contrast, was aligned with the United States, benefiting from American support due to its proximity to Afghanistan and role in countering Soviet influence. When the USSR fell, this geopolitical structure collapsed with it, forcing South Asian countries to rethink their strategies in an increasingly unipolar world. India faced the most dramatic adjustment. The Soviet Union had been New Delhi's primary partner for decades, providing diplomatic support in international organizations and offering favorable military and economic agreements. With its collapse, India lost a powerful ally. This pushed Indian leaders to diversify their foreign policy and improve relations with the United States. The 1990s saw the beginning of a shift toward economic liberalization in India, opening markets to global competition and foreign investment. This economic transformation helped reposition India as a rising global power in the early 21st century. At the same time, India moved to consolidate its regional security. The lack of Soviet support made India more determined to strengthen its nuclear program as a deterrent in an unpredictable world. Tensions with Pakistan remained high, and in 1998 India conducted a series of nuclear tests. Pakistan responded with its own tests, transforming the subcontinent into a nuclear-armed region. The absence of the USSR's influence allowed these developments to unfold with fewer constraints, dramatically reshaping South Asia's strategic balance. Pakistan also faced challenges and opportunities. With the Cold War over, the U.S.-Pakistan partnership shifted. American interest in Pakistan declined sharply in the early 1990s, leading to sanctions and a withdrawal of military aid. However, instability in Afghanistan and Pakistan's role in the rise of the Taliban soon brought renewed international attention. Pakistan increasingly relied on China for military and diplomatic support. Beijing, eager to expand its influence in South Asia, deepened military cooperation, infrastructure investment, and political alignment with Islamabad. This China-Pakistan partnership became a cornerstone of regional geopolitics. Meanwhile, Afghanistan experienced one of the most dramatic consequences of the Soviet collapse. After the USSR ended its occupation in 1989, the communist government it left behind managed to hold on until 1992. Once the Soviet Union dissolved, however, economic and military support evaporated. Afghanistan descended into civil war among rival Mujahideen factions. This chaos created the conditions for the rise of the Taliban in the mid-1990s. Their rule and their alliance with extremist groups like Al-Qaeda would bring major global ramifications, culminating in the events of September 11, 2001. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal also navigated significant political and economic changes. Bangladesh pursued economic reforms and expanded garment exports, integrating more deeply into global markets. Sri Lanka continued to face its long civil war in which global dynamics, including foreign support for different factions, played important roles. Nepal underwent political upheaval, leading eventually to the end of its monarchy and the rise of a Maoist-led government. Across the region, one theme emerged: Without the Cold War framework, South Asian countries were free to reshape their alliances, redefine their strategic goals, and assert their independence. This created new opportunities for growth and cooperation, but also introduced new risks, particularly in nuclear politics and regional rivalries. One of the most far-reaching global developments of the post-Soviet era was the rise of transnational extremist movements and the emergence of a new form of conflict, the global war on terror. While terrorism existed long before 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War created geopolitical conditions that enabled extremist networks to expand dramatically. During the Cold War, superpower competition shaped global conflicts. The USSR and the United States supported proxy forces, governments, and militant groups based on ideological alignment. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many of these proxy networks lost funding, structure, and purpose. The uncertainty left behind created power vacuums in regions like Afghanistan, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. In Afghanistan, the departure of Soviet forces and the collapse of the Soviet-backed government triggered a brutal civil war. Eventually, the Taliban emerged as the dominant faction, establishing a repressive regime that provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, extremist ideologies spread more rapidly in the 1990s, fueled by regional conflicts, economic hardship, social fragmentation, and the collapse of previously authoritarian structures. Radical groups exploited political instability, using modern communication technologies to recruit, train, and coordinate across borders. Western nations, believing the end of the Cold War had reduced major threats, often underestimated the growing danger posed by non-state actors. This changed decisively on September 11, 2001, when al-Qaeda carried out the most devastating terrorist attack in modern history. The attack signaled a new era, where global security threats no longer came from superpowers, but from decentralized networks capable of striking anywhere. The United States responded with the global war on terror, launching military operations in Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban. This intervention marked America's return to large-scale military engagement in Central Asia, a region it had previously viewed primarily through the lens of the Cold War. The war on terror expanded to include operations in Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, the Sahel region of Africa, and other areas. It transformed U.S. foreign policy, military strategy, and intelligence operations. Many countries, including NATO allies, joined the effort, reshaping international alliances. At the same time, critics argued that the war on terror produced unintended consequences, destabilizing regions, strengthening extremist recruitment narratives, and diverting resources from domestic priorities. Globally, counterterrorism became a central element of international diplomacy. Governments strengthened borders, increased surveillance, and expanded security cooperation. Extremist attacks in Europe, Asia, and Africa reinforced the sense that terrorism had become a long-term global challenge rather than a localized problem. Importantly, the rise of global terrorism cannot be separated from the geopolitical transformations triggered by the Soviet collapse. State disintegration, weak governance, shifting alliances, and the emergence of ungoverned spaces created fertile ground for extremist networks. Thus, the post-Soviet era did not usher in lasting peace. It ushered in a new era of conflict defined not by ideological blocs, but by decentralized threats, asymmetrical warfare, and globalized security challenges. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a fundamentally new global order, one defined not only by the disappearance of a superpower, but by the emergence of a fragmented post-Soviet space. 15 sovereign states replaced what had once been a single political entity stretching across 11 time zones. Each of these nations embarked on its own path, shaped by history, geography, culture, and political ambition. The resulting landscape was uneven and unpredictable, characterized by competing visions of sovereignty, identity, and modernization. In Eastern Europe and the Baltics, the collapse of the Soviet Union marked the beginning of a rapid political and economic transformation. Nations such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia embraced Western institutions almost immediately, integrating into the European Union and NATO by the mid-2000s. These countries saw independence as a return to their rightful place in Europe, culturally, economically, and historically. They pursued democratic reforms, privatization, and institutional modernization with determination. Their success stories became examples of how small states could leverage Western partnerships to build stable, prosperous societies. Central Europe, including Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, also benefited from distancing themselves from Moscow. Though not Soviet republics, they had been under Soviet influence for decades and seized the opportunity to pursue integration with Western structures. This alignment reshaped the balance of power across the continent, shifting Eastern Europe's center of gravity firmly toward Brussels and Washington. In contrast, many former Soviet republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia followed very different trajectories. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia became arenas of unresolved conflicts, geopolitical competition, and regional tensions. While Georgia strived for Western integration, culminating in the Rose Revolution, its territorial disputes with Russia and internal challenges complicated its progress. Azerbaijan leveraged its oil wealth to build an independent foreign policy and strengthen its military position, especially regarding Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia struggled with its own economic constraints and security dependence, resulting in a fragile geopolitical balancing act. Central Asian states embraced authoritarian political structures, often preserving elements of Soviet governance while modifying them to suit local elites. Kazakhstan became a major regional power, balancing relationships with Russia, China, and the West. Uzbekistan pursued its own isolationist path before gradually opening up in the 2010s. Turkmenistan maintained strict neutrality and authoritarian control, while Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan struggled with political instability, corruption, and violence. These varied trajectories demonstrated the profound diversity of the post-Soviet experience. Russia itself, the largest successor state, claimed the mantle of historical continuity. Although the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia inherited most of its institutions, nuclear arsenal, diplomatic networks, and strategic ambitions. The Russian Federation positioned itself as the primary power in Eurasia, though its capabilities were initially weakened by the economic crisis of the 1990s. As the new century unfolded, Russia oscillated between cooperation with the West and assertive efforts to re-establish influence over former Soviet republics. This tension became a defining feature of the post-Soviet geopolitical order. Ultimately, the post-Soviet world became a mosaic of systems: vibrant democracies, struggling transitional states, entrenched authoritarian regimes, and unresolved conflict zones. The long-term legacy of the Soviet collapse is thus not a single narrative, but a wide spectrum of outcomes that continue to shape global politics today. While Russia's initial post-Soviet years were marked by economic collapse, political instability, and declining international influence, the early 2000s witnessed a dramatic shift. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, Russia began reasserting itself on the world stage. Putin's strategy was rooted in the belief that the Soviet collapse was not merely a historical event, but a geopolitical catastrophe that diminished Russia's global status and fractured its regional influence. His mission, therefore, was to restore Russia's power, preserve its sphere of influence, and challenge what Moscow viewed as Western encroachment. One of the first elements of this strategy involved consolidating political authority within Russia. Putin reduced the power of the oligarchs, re-centralized state institutions, and strengthened the role of security services. Media outlets were brought under closer state control, and political opposition faced increasing restrictions. These moves allowed the Kremlin to craft a unified foreign policy vision that drew heavily on themes of nationalism, sovereignty, and historical continuity. Russia's increased economic stability, fueled by rising oil and gas prices, provided the resources needed to rebuild military capabilities and modernize infrastructure. Regionally, Russia sought to re-establish dominance across the former Soviet space. It opposed NATO expansion, viewing it as a threat to Russian security. This tension became particularly acute in countries like Georgia and Ukraine, where pro-Western governments sought closer ties with NATO and the EU. In 2008, Russia went to war with Georgia over the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, demonstrating its willingness to use military force to maintain influence. Russia's victory in the conflict signaled a stark shift in post-Soviet geopolitics. Moscow would no longer passively accept what it considered Western encroachment. This assertiveness reached a new level in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea following the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. The annexation marked the first forcible territorial change in Europe since World War II and sparked the most severe East-West confrontation since the Cold War. Russia justified its actions by invoking historical claims, strategic necessity, and the need to protect Russian-speaking populations. Western nations responded with sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and increased support for Ukraine. The war in eastern Ukraine, fueled by Russian-backed separatists, evolved into a protracted conflict that reshaped European security dynamics. Russia's involvement in Syria, beginning in 2015, further demonstrated its intention to reclaim global influence. By supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime, Russia positioned itself as a major actor in Middle Eastern politics, challenging U.S. dominance and securing military footholds in the region. This intervention showcased Russia's willingness to project power beyond its immediate neighborhood. Regionally, Russia sought to re-establish dominance across the former Soviet space. It opposed NATO expansion, viewing it as a threat to Russian security. This tension became particularly acute in countries like Georgia and Ukraine, where pro-Western governments sought closer ties with NATO and the EU. In 2008, Russia went to war with Georgia over the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, demonstrating its willingness to use military force to maintain influence. Russia's victory in the conflict signaled a stark shift in post-Soviet geopolitics. Moscow would no longer passively accept what it considered Western encroachment. This assertiveness reached a new level in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea following the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. The annexation marked the first forcible territorial change in Europe since World War II and sparked the most severe East-West confrontation since the Cold War. Russia justified its actions by invoking historical claims, strategic necessity, and the need to protect Russian-speaking populations. Western nations responded with sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and increased support for Ukraine. The war in eastern Ukraine, fueled by Russian-backed separatists, evolved into a protracted conflict that reshaped European security dynamics. Russia's involvement in Syria, beginning in 2015, further demonstrated its intention to reclaim global influence. By supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime, Russia positioned itself as a major actor in Middle Eastern politics, challenging U.S. dominance and securing military footholds in the region. This intervention showcased Russia's willingness to project power beyond its immediate neighborhood. By the 2020s, Russia had firmly re-established itself as a central player in global competition. Its strategy emphasized multipolarity, a world where the U.S. no longer enjoys unchallenged primacy, and power is distributed among major states, including China, India, and Russia itself. Moscow's actions reflect a broader effort to challenge the post-Cold War order, redefine its borders of influence, and assert sovereignty over its perceived sphere. Russia's resurgence highlights a core truth. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not end geopolitical competition. It merely transformed it. The tensions and rivalries born from the Soviet breakup continue to influence global political dynamics, shaping the contours of modern geopolitics. More than 3 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed, its legacy remains deeply woven into the political, economic, and security fabric of the modern world. The dissolution did not simply redraw borders. It reshaped identities, redefined alliances, and created new fault lines that still shape international relations. Understanding today's geopolitical landscape requires understanding the transformations set in motion between 1985 and 1991. One of the most significant legacies is the unresolved tension between global integration and national identity. In the West, the fall of the USSR accelerated globalization, the expansion of NATO, the deepening of the European Union, and the spread of market capitalism. These developments shaped the modern international system. However, they also generated backlash, contributing to skepticism about Western institutions, debates over sovereignty, and the rise of populist movements. Many societies continue to grapple with the question of how to balance global engagement with cultural and political independence. The post-Soviet space remains one of the most strategically contested regions in the world. Conflicts in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova reflect unresolved disputes dating back to Soviet policies, borders, and demographic engineering. These regions serve as flashpoints between Western interests and Russian ambitions. The Russia-NATO relationship remains deeply influenced by the geopolitical map created after 1991. The question of European security, how to prevent war, manage alliances, and ensure state sovereignty, is directly connected to the legacy of Soviet dissolution. Global security has also been shaped by the shifts unleashed in 1991. Nuclear proliferation concerns expanded as new states inherited Soviet nuclear infrastructure. International security frameworks had to adapt to decentralized threats, including terrorism, cyber warfare, and hybrid conflict strategies. The collapse of a single authoritarian superpower created space for new forms of instability and new centers of power. Economically, the transition from state socialism to global capitalism produced both dramatic success stories and profound inequalities. Former Soviet states followed divergent paths, from Estonia's digital transformation to Turkmenistan's isolationist authoritarianism. These disparities influence migration patterns, labor markets, and economic partnerships across Eurasia. They also shape global energy markets. Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and others play major roles in oil and gas supply chains. Culturally, the Soviet collapse reshaped national identities. Societies across Eastern Europe rediscovered suppressed histories and languages. Russia revived pre-Soviet nationalism. Central Asian nations emphasized Islamic and Turkic heritage. The revival of identity created new cultural renaissances, but also new social divisions. Lastly, the Soviet collapse altered the long-term trajectory of global power competition. The unipolar moment of U.S. dominance has faded. A new multipolar world is emerging, defined by U.S.-China rivalry, Russia's assertive foreign policy, India's rise, and shifting alliances across Africa, Latin America, and Middle East. None of these dynamics can be understood without recognizing that the Soviet collapse opened the geopolitical space in which this new era could unfold. In essence, the fall of the Soviet Union was not merely an event. It was a turning point that continues to shape the 21st century. The world we live in today, with its opportunities, crises, alliances, and conflicts, grew directly from the political and ideological earthquake that took place between 1985 and 1991. Its legacy remains alive, powerful, and deeply relevant in every corner of global affairs. You've just listened to one of the most important stories in modern history. A story of ambition, reform, chaos, courage, collapse, and the rebirth of nations. Today we saw how one leader tried to save a failing system, how openness unleashed forces no one could control, how entire nations rediscovered their identity, how new conflicts were born from old borders, how Russia fell and rose again, how China learned from a rival's mistakes, how the United States became the world's only superpower, and how the world we live in today still carries the scars and lessons of 1991. The moral of this history is simple but powerful. When a system ignores its people, resists change until it's too late, and loses the trust of its own citizens, collapse becomes inevitable. And when power shifts suddenly, the whole world feels the tremors. Thank you for spending your time with History Teller YT. If you want more epic journeys into the past, more untold stories, and more deep dives that make history come alive, make sure to return to this channel. Your curiosity is your greatest strength, and here it will always be welcomed. Until next time, this is History Teller YT, signing off. But history never sleeps, and neither do we.